No one dared help her, until a rancher said, "Enough." The day Margaret Holloway rode into Dry Creek, the town already knew her name, and not one soul came out to greet her. She had been riding for 11 hours straight, her chestnut mare breathing hard beneath her, foam flecking the bit, hooves cracked from the stone road that wound down through the canyon like a scar cut into the earth. Margaret was 31 years old, and she looked every single day of it, dust in her hair, blood dried at the corner of her mouth from where a man 3 counties back had backhanded her for asking directions to a telegraph office. She hadn't cried then. She didn't cry now. She just rode in, spine straight, jaw set, eyes moving the way eyes move when they've learned to count exits before they count people. Dry Creek in the year 1883 was not a town you came to on purpose. It sat in a bowl of cracked alkaline earth between 2 ridgelines, the kind of place that existed because the railroad had once considered passing through and then decided against it, leaving behind a water tower, a saloon, a livery stable, a general store, and about 200 people who'd all somehow convinced themselves they were just passing through too. The permanence of the place was accidental, the way grief is, something that arrives without invitation and simply refuses to leave. Margaret tied her horse outside the general store and walked in. The man behind the counter, bald and thick-armed, watched her come through the door the way you watch weather rolling in, not with welcome, not with hostility, just the flat assessment of a man calculating what kind of trouble this might turn into. She put 3 coins on the counter. "Telegraph. Is there one in this town?" "Post office," he said, not moving. "Down the end of Main, left side. Parsons runs it." She nodded and turned to leave. "You got family here?" he called after her. It wasn't curiosity. It was the town's immune system, checking whether this was something familiar or something foreign. "No," she said, and walked out. The telegraph office was dark inside, smelling of ink and old wood and something else, kerosene, maybe, or the particular loneliness of small spaces where people come only with bad news. A thin man with a bird-like neck sat behind a desk, a green visor shading eyes that held no particular light in them. She wrote out the message on a slip of paper and slid it across to him. He looked at it, and something shifted in his face, the small, involuntary twitch of a man who has just read something he wishes he hadn't. "Address this to?" he asked. "It's all there," she said. "The name." "The county seat." "Judge Aldrich." The thin man said nothing for a moment. Outside, a horse went past at a walk, and somewhere in the town a door closed. Then he looked up at her and said, very quietly, "I can't send this." She looked at him. "I'm sorry." "Wire's been down since Tuesday," he said. "Storm took the line up past the ridge." She held his eyes for 3 full seconds. He didn't blink, but his hand, resting on the counter, moved very slightly, just the fingers, curling inward, the way fingers do when a person is holding something back. "When will it be repaired?" she asked. "Hard to say." She picked up the slip of paper and walked out. She stood on the porch of the telegraph office for a moment, the late afternoon light going copper across the street, and she understood, not with surprise, not even with particular anger, just with that cold, settling clarity of a woman who has understood this same thing in a dozen different towns across 3 states, that she was being managed. That the wire probably worked fine. That Parsons had been told, or paid, or frightened, or all 3, and that the message she was carrying, the thing that could bring a federal circuit judge down on Dry Creek like the hand of God, was not going to leave this town by telegraph. That meant she was going to have to carry it herself. Which meant she needed to rest, and to eat, and to figure out who in Dry Creek, if anyone, was not in the pocket of Elliot Voss. The name Elliot Voss was not spoken aloud in Dry Creek without a particular quality to the voice. Not fear, exactly, fear is too clean a word for what it was. It was the sound of people who have swallowed something they can't digest, who have learned to move carefully around a fact that can't be faced directly. Voss owned the Broken Spur, the largest cattle operation in the valley, and he owned most of what surrounded it too, 3 smaller ranches absorbed over the years through debt and drought, and 1 fire that everyone knew wasn't an accident and no one would say so. He had a lawyer in Santa Fe and a man in the county sheriff's office, and whatever remained of the town's conscience had long since learned to stay quiet and keep its eyes down. What Margaret was carrying, folded inside the lining of her coat, was a letter. 3 pages, handwritten, in the careful deliberate script of a man who knew he was dying and wanted every word to count. The letter was from Daniel Reyes, who had worked as Voss's foreman for 8 years, and who had watched, 2 months ago, a thing happen that he could not unfold from his mind after it had folded itself in. The letter described, in exact detail, the murder of a homesteader named Colton Greer, his wife, and their 17-year-old son, on 120 acres that Voss had wanted and Greer had refused to sell. Daniel Reyes had died 6 days after writing the letter. The county coroner called it heart failure. His wife, Clara, had brought the letter to Margaret, who was a woman Clara had met once, 2 years ago, at a church social in another county entirely, and who Clara somehow, desperately, with the logic of people who have no other options, believed might be able to do something with it. Clara had whispered in Margaret's ear at a wagon yard in Alamosa and pressed the letter into her hands and then climbed into a wagon headed south and did not look back, because looking back, for Clara Reyes, had become something she simply could not afford. Margaret had been trying to get this letter to Judge Aldrich for 19 days. In that time, 2 men had followed her out of Alamosa and she'd lost them in the canyon country east of Taos. She'd had the letter taken from her once, in a rooming house, and had spent 4 hours in the dark convincing herself it was truly gone, and then found it again, sewn into the hem of a dress she hadn't worn since Alamosa, where Clara, with the quiet genius of women who have learned to plan for betrayal, had sewn a second copy. 2 copies. Clara had made 2 copies. Margaret had pressed her fingers against the letter in the lining of her coat and felt something close to love for a woman she barely knew. Now she was in Dry Creek, the nearest town to the route she needed to travel to reach the county seat, and she had no horse that could make it another 20 miles without rest, and a telegraph that supposedly didn't work, and a town that had clearly already been told she was coming. She needed food and a room and one person who wasn't compromised. She went to the saloon, because saloons are democracies, everyone is equal in their need for a drink, and the man behind the bar has heard enough of people's actual selves to be harder to buy than most. The saloon was called the Meridian, which was a pretentious name for a room with sawdust floors and 2 of its 4 windows boarded over. She sat at the bar and ordered food, not drink, and ate beans and cornbread without tasting any of it, watching the room in the mirror behind the bar. There were 9 men in the place. 6 of them she assessed and dismissed, ranch hands, drifters, a man who looked like a traveling merchant nursing a whiskey with the careful attention of someone making it last. 2 others she watched more carefully, a heavy-set man with a deputy's badge pinned unevenly to his coat, eating alone, not looking up, and a younger man at the far end of the bar who had been watching her in the mirror since she sat down, not with the look men use when they want something, but with something closer to calculation. She paid for her food and left. Outside, the young man followed her out. She stopped in the street and turned to face him before he could think she hadn't noticed. He was maybe 25, lean, with dark eyes and the kind of sunburn that comes from working outdoors year-round, not visiting. He held up both hands, empty, a gesture of intent, and said, "I'm not with Voss." She looked at him. That's the first thing someone with Voss would say. Probably, he agreed. I'm Tom Aldana. I run the livery. Your horse needs the right front shoe reset, she's about 3 steps from throwing it. Margaret said nothing. I heard what Parsons told you about the wire, Tom Aldana said, and lowered his voice so that the word came out just above a breath. He lied. Wire works. He sent a message this morning, 3 hours before you rode in. She looked at him for a long moment. The street was quiet around them, that specific quality of small-town quiet that isn't peaceful but watchful, as if the buildings themselves are listening. Why are you telling me this? She asked. He looked down at the dust for a moment, then back up at her, and she saw something in his face that she recognized, the look of a person who has been quiet for a long time and has reached the bottom of their capacity for it. "Colton Greer was my uncle," he said. She stood very still. "I know what you're carrying," he said. "Clara wrote to me. Told me what she'd done, told me who she'd given it to. I've been waiting 3 weeks for someone I don't know to ride into this town and try to do something." He paused. "I have a fresh horse. Strong one. 15 hands, good feet, knows the night road north." She looked at him. "Voss has people watching the road north." "He has 2 men watching the road north," Tom said. "He doesn't have anyone watching the creek bed that runs parallel to it for 4 miles before it hits the canyon mouth." She looked at him for another long moment. In her experience, help from strangers came in 2 varieties, the kind born of genuine conscience and the kind born of someone wanting to get close to what you were carrying. The difference between them was almost impossible to read from the outside. But Tom Aldana's face held something that she had learned, over years of this work, to assign some weight to, grief that hadn't gone cool yet. His uncle had been killed. His face still held the rawness of that. And raw grief, in her experience, was harder to manufacture than almost anything else. "When?" she asked. 2 hours after dark," he said. "Come to the livery from the back, off the alley." He turned and walked away before she could answer, which was either confidence or the practiced manner of a man who'd learned not to linger in plain sight. She found a room at the boarding house, a woman named Hetty Crane running it, wide, quiet, with eyes that gave nothing away, and she paid for 1 night and carried her saddlebag upstairs and lay down on the narrow bed without removing her boots and stared at the ceiling. The room was small and hot and the ceiling had a crack in it that ran from the window to the corner in the shape of a river on a map. She lay there for 90 minutes, not sleeping, running the route in her mind. Creek bed, for miles north, then the canyon mouth, then the road to Mescalero, then the valley road, 20 miles to the county seat, where Judge Aldrich was in session through the end of the week. She had 3 days. She thought about Colton Greer's wife. She didn't know her name. The letter hadn't said. Daniel Reyes had named Colton and the son's name was Eli, 17 years old, which was the age her own brother had been when he died, not from violence but from fever, though the way grief worked meant that this detail was never neutral, but not the wife. Just the family. Just all 3 of them, which meant a woman whose name Margaret didn't know had died on land she'd probably planted and watered and pulled rocks out of alongside her husband, and she would go into whatever record Judge Aldrich made of this as Mrs. Greer, if she was lucky, as nothing if she wasn't. Margaret pressed her fingers against the coat lining. She got up at dusk and ate again, the boarding house dining room, cornbread again, which seemed to be the primary crop of this county, and sat at a table near the window, watching the street go dark. 2 men had stationed themselves across the road in a natural and unnatural way, the way men stand when they're told to watch something and told to look like they're not. Voss knew she was here. Which meant the 2-hour window Tom had given her was probably generous. She went upstairs, came down the back stairs she'd identified on arrival, moved through the boarding house kitchen past a startled cook who met her eyes and then looked away. The cook looked away quickly, which in Margaret's experience was more reassuring than anything the woman could have said, because people who look away are scared and people who are scared are not announcing her position, and out the back door into the alley. Dry Creek's alley was narrow and dark and smelled of horse and garbage and the specific rot of something organic that had been dead long enough to stop smelling like death and start smelling like earth. She moved along it to the livery's back gate, which was unlatched, which meant Tom Aldana had been here recently and had not yet made any mistakes she knew about. The livery was dark inside but not empty. Tom was there, and the horse, a gray, broad-chested, with the compact powerful hindquarters of an animal that had been bred for something more than standing in a field. The horse was already saddled. There was also a man Margaret didn't know, standing in the shadows near the far stall, which caused her hand to move toward her coat before Tom spoke. "This is Will Drummond," Tom said quietly. "He ranches north of the creek. He's been waiting for this too." Will Drummond stepped forward into the thin light. He was maybe 50, with a gray beard going white and the kind of face that outdoor decades carve into a certain shape, sun-hardened, line-cut, expressive only when something is worth the expression. He looked at Margaret with eyes that moved over her the way a carpenter's eyes move over a piece of work, not dismissively, but with the kind of honest assessment that isn't personal. "You've got the letter," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've got a letter," she said carefully. He nodded once, accepting the distinction. "Voss has 4 men outside tonight, not 2. Something changed in the last hour, message came in, I think." He looked at Tom. "Parsons." Tom's jaw moved. "There's a second road," Will said. "It doesn't go north. It goes east, 6 miles to the Harker Ranch, and from there north on a trail that isn't on any map because I cut it myself 8 years ago when I was running cattle in the canyon country. It adds 4 hours. "I don't have 4 hours, Margaret said. "You have 4 hours or you have a conversation with whoever Voss sends," Will said simply. She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I watched what happened to the Greers and I didn't move fast enough to stop it and I've been living with that for 2 months, and I am 61 years of age and I've been a coward about this for 60 days and I'm tired." There was nothing to say to that. She turned to Tom. "The creek bed route, 4 men can cover it. He's got the livery watched," Tom said. "They'll know when you leave." "Then I need them to think I've already gone north," she said. She looked around the livery. "Is there anyone in this town, who knows how to ride and is willing to be a problem for about 20 minutes? Tom and Will looked at each other. The next part of the plan was not elegant. Elegance was a luxury Margaret had stopped expecting from plans a long time ago. What it was functional, a 16-year-old boy named Jesper, who worked the livery evenings and who Tom vouched for with the particular confidence of a man who has known someone since they were born, rode out the front of the livery on a bay mare wearing Margaret's coat and hat at a canter, north up Main Street, drawing 2 of Voss's 4 watchers after him into the dark. Jesper knew the creek bed route. He was to take it, confuse anyone following for as long as possible, and then circle back through the canyon to the Aldana Ranch by morning. It was the kind of thing you ask a 16-year-old boy to do only if you first looked him in the eyes and satisfied yourself that he understands the weight of it. Margaret had looked at Jesper, and he'd looked back at her with the steady gaze of someone who has already, somewhere in his short life, decided what kind of person he intends to be, and she'd felt, for a moment, the specific ache of hoping very hard that nothing bad happened to him. Then she'd taken the gray horse and gone east. Will Drummond rode with her for the first 2 miles, guiding her through a dark that was absolute, no moon, cloud cover thick and flat, the kind of darkness that turns landscape into a texture of sounds and the shifting pressure of wind. The horse was sure-footed and didn't stumble. Will rode without speaking, which was the best thing he could have done. At the fork where the east trail split from the canyon road, he pulled up. "Straight east," he said, "for 3 miles. You'll come to the Harker homestead. Light in the window if Cora's expecting you. I sent a boy ahead at sundown. She'll give you fresh water and the trail start." He paused. "The trail is marked by stacked stones at each turn. 3 stones means left. 2 means right. 1 means straight." He paused again. "Don't miss any of them." "I won't," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the dark, and she couldn't read his face, but something in the quality of his silence told her that he was doing the same thing she was doing, calculating what the next hours might produce and whether any of it would matter and holding on to something that wasn't quite hope but was what people use in place of hope when hope seems too expensive. "Aldrich is a good man," Will said finally. "He'll do something with it." "He'll do something with it," Margaret agreed, and rode east. The Harker homestead was where Will had said it would be, and the light was in the window, and Cora Harker was a woman of perhaps 40 with flour on her hands and a rifle leaning against the door frame who looked at Margaret and said, "Drink water, let the horse drink, go fast." 3 sentences, which was about the right amount. Margaret drank and the horse drank and Cora handed up a wrapped bundle, hardtack, dried meat, a small canteen, and pointed to the trailhead without being asked. "Stacked stones," Margaret said. "Don't miss any of them," Cora said, and stepped back, and Margaret rode into the dark. The trail wound up through canyon country that was beautiful in a way that only existed when you were in it and couldn't be remembered accurately afterward, the smell of juniper and cold rock, the sound of water somewhere below, the particular sensation of altitude change that your body registers before your mind does. The horse moved well. Margaret moved with it, not fighting the rhythm, not thinking more than she needed to, watching for stones. She missed one turn about 2 hours in. Rode for almost 10 minutes before something, the angle of the wind, the sound quality, the way the trail had stopped feeling used, told her the mistake. She backtracked and found the stones she'd ridden past in the dark, 3 of them stacked at the base of a juniper, barely visible. She took the left turn and rode on. The eastern sky was beginning to suggest rather than show light when she came down off the high trail and onto the valley road, and Dry Creek was 30 miles behind her, and the county seat was 9 miles north, and she was cold and tired and her hands had gone slightly numb inside her gloves, and the letter was still in the lining of her coat, both copies, Clara Reyes's careful doubled work still intact. She made the county seat as the sun fully rose. Judge Aldrich's court was in session at 9 in the morning. Margaret arrived at 8:15, which gave her 45 minutes in the anteroom outside his chambers, which she spent sitting very still with her coat in her lap and her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that a young clerk had brought her with the faint discomfort of a person who has never quite seen someone arrive looking like this and wasn't sure what it meant. She had rehearsed what she would say. Not the words, exactly, but the shape of it, the sequence that would move a careful judge from skepticism to attention to action. She knew Aldrich by reputation, methodical, slow to anger, not easily moved by sentiment but deeply moved by evidence, a man who had built a career on the idea that process and truth were the same thing and that patience in service of justice was not weakness but its highest form. When he called her in, he was standing behind his desk reading something, and he looked up at her with the eyes of a man who has learned to read the condition of people who appear before him the way a doctor reads a patient, quickly, accurately, without being unkind about it. She put both copies of the letter on his desk. She sat down when he gestured. She told him what she'd told herself she would tell him, who Daniel Reyes was, what he'd seen, how Clara had moved the letter, what had happened across the 19 days, what had happened in Dry Creek, the false wire, the 4 men, Jesper on the bay mare in her coat riding north as misdirection, Will Drummond at the fork, Cora Harker with flour on her hands and a rifle by the door, 3 stones meaning left, 2 meaning right, 1 meaning straight. Aldrich listened without interrupting, which is the most powerful thing a person with authority can do, not perform listening but actually perform it, with the whole body, the full attention, the silence that means what you are saying is going in and being held. When she finished, he sat down, and read both copies of the letter, and read them again, and was quiet for a long time. "You understand what this does," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He looked up at her. "To you, I mean. Specifically." She looked back at him. "I understand." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he turned and called for the clerk and began, in the calm and measured voice of a man who has decided something and is not going to undecide it, to issue instructions that would bring a federal investigation to the valley around Dry Creek and the operations of Elliot Voss before the end of that same week. She sat in the chair and listened and let the coffee go cold in her hands. She thought about Clara Reyes on the wagon going south, not looking back. She thought about Daniel Reyes writing 3 pages with the careful script of a dying man, wanting every word to count. She thought about Colton Greer's wife, whose name she still didn't know, on 120 acres she would never grow anything in again. She thought about Jesper on the bay mare, riding north in the dark wearing her coat and her hat, and hoped he was home by now, or near enough. She thought about Will Drummond at the fork in the road, saying, "I've been a coward for 60 days and I'm tired," which was the most honest sentence she'd heard in 3 states and which she would carry with her for a long time, the way you carry sentences that break something open in you and leave it open. The clerk was writing. The judge was talking. Outside the window the valley lay in morning light, and somewhere 30 miles south, Dry Creek sat in its bowl of alkaline earth between two ridgelines, and the broken spur stretched across more land than one man needed, and two of Voss's men were probably still chasing a decoy north through the canyon. And Tom Aldana was probably at his livery by now doing the ordinary work of the morning with the specific quality of a person who has done something they have not yet processed. Elliot Voss did not know yet. He would, before the week was out. Federal marshals came to Dry Creek on a Thursday, which was the same day every week that the general store received its supply delivery, so the street was unusually full of people when the four riders came in from the north and tied up outside the Broken Spurs town office. The bald man at the counter, whose name was Fletcher, watched through his window and said nothing to anyone. Parsons at the telegraph office stood in his doorway and watched and also said nothing. The deputy with the badge pinned unevenly to his coat was nowhere to be seen, which was either cowardice or the beginning of wisdom. Voss was brought out of the Broken Spurs main ranch house by two marshals on a Friday morning, which was a clear day, the kind of clear that the high country produces after a storm, with a quality of light that makes everything look like it's been washed and set out to dry. Margaret was not there to see it. She had left the county on Wednesday. She had one more letter in her coat by then, not from Clara Reyes, but from Judge Aldrich himself, addressed to a circuit prosecutor in the next territory, who was handling a matter that had been waiting for the kind of witness only a certain kind of person could find, in a certain kind of town, under certain kinds of conditions. She rode north on a road she'd never been on before, in morning light, and the horse under her was steady, and the road was clear, and she did not look back. Not because she couldn't. But because there was already something ahead that needed seeing.